All right, I think I might be back. Let's talk about lights and lasers. Okay, so real quick, I know I've been absent from this platform for a long time, and honestly, I've been pretty quiet on social media in general for a few months, and it's been kind of nice. But getting back into it all, and I've been pushing stuff on Instagram pretty consistently this entire time, and getting back at that lately. Gonna get back at pushing stuff here as well, all right? Because I know there are a lot of y'all that don't do Instagram, so you come to YouTube for your information, and then Instagram is not a great place for this longer stuff where I can go into more details. So gonna start trying to push more here. But without further ado, let's get into the topic: setting up lights and lasers. Okay, starting with white lights. So a consideration, right? A light, it's glass, it's got that bezel in there, so there's reflection. Now, this may or may not be important to you and what you do and what you use your heater for, but that shine off of that is something to consider. That is a concern, during the daytime and even on, approaching to a target. If you're trying to remain completely concealed, every little bit counts. In addition to that, you want something that will help you negate the effects of a white light ND. Sorry. With something like this, 100 Concepts light caps. All right, you can DIY them the way that we used to with scope caps for sure. They do wear out a lot faster, but it's out there. You can even just tape it if you have to. The point here is not about selling a product. It's about I want something that will help me eliminate that shine when I don't want that shine, that will help me mitigate the effect of a light ND if I booger that up. And I want it to be easy to remove, right? If I just taped it, I gotta peel that tape off. But if I have something like this, it's easy to remove, okay? Now, I do also want my light to be as tight to the platform as I can get it. The further off that sticks, the more it's going to be able to snag on things. Again, you may not be super concerned about that, and you might be like, well, my white light has never snagged in anything, and that's because you only take it to the range. If you work in a profession where you have to move through the bush to get to a target, to get to where you're going to do your work, then you understand that the bush monster is always trying to eat you and all of your gear, and so it's going to snag on everything it possibly can. So keeping that tighter. I was also a parachutist and a diver, so I'm always looking at things from that perspective of having lines snag on stuff. So the tighter that light is, the less likely a line or anything can get in there and snag on it and become a nuisance, if not a hazard. Okay. I also like to try to set up my white light so it's as close to the laser emitter as possible. Now at the Raid, the laser comes out the center right over the barrel, so it really doesn't matter either side. This is a PEC 15, and the laser emitter is here on the right side of the module. Same for the PEC 2, same for the Engol. The PEC 16 was the other way, which irritated me, and it had a really shitty light, so I didn't like the PEC 16. But outside of that, this is why I like putting my lights on the right side, because a vast majority of lasers that I have used, the laser emitter is on the right side. For me, it also puts the the light on the outside of the gun, so it doesn't interfere at all with how I'm gonna grab the rifle. If I start putting the light on the inside, I've got big enough hands that I could grab around a light body and the rail of a gun. There were times I'd set up my M4 that way, to where I had the laser on one side, the light on the other, my activation switches on top, and it was okay, but it wasn't great, and we're going to get into that a little bit in this video as well. So I keep it on the right side, keep this left side nice and free. Now, if you want to do direct activation of the light with your support hand thumb, then obviously it needs to go on that same side. When you do that, consider the light mount heavily, because you're going to want to be able to push that forward enough that you can grab the rifle the way you want to grab it, and your thumb will be in a good spot to hit the tail cap of that light. You can set it up so you're basically grabbing around the light body and have a remote switch where your thumb can hit it. But now you're making things a little more complex than they need to. You may be disrupting your grip. Again, hand size varies. So that method isn't something I would heavily recommend, but it is a way of doing business, all right? I prefer on the right side, getting it nice and tight as possible. And then I do a remote switch for my white light. It's the same on both of these guys, right? Remote switch for the white light, but then each of these caps also can be manually activated on the tail cap. The Surefire one here has a small button, and it's set up for the top of the rail so that if I need to use it, I can just roll my hand over and hit that switch. This one is from Modlight. It's an interesting setup, but it has a much larger button compared to this tiny little Surefire one. The downside with this is that light is pushed so far forward to mitigate shadow when the can is on it that I can't just roll my hand over and hit that with my thumb the way I can this one. I would actually have to go under the gun and hit it with my finger. So it's not ideal, but it's like my emergency means of activating that light if I have to, if for some reason that switch doesn't work, okay? So I like remote switches for the light. I put them behind the laser box, and the consideration with that is I need to be able to change the battery. So it's pretty easy to set it up so you can get the cap off, but then can you actually pull the battery out? Now with the accent switch here from Unity, this one is actually like bolted onto the rail. It's screwed together, so I can't just pop it off. This Modlight hot button holder, mod button holder, it can just pop right off. Same thing like if you run the Surefire dual pad, dual lead, it just pops right off and it pops right back on. Easy breezy, and so you can push the switch really, really close to the laser. The only thing that's going to prevent you from removing it is, how tight do you have all the cables and the mitigation there. Dual switches are going to require more cable management. And again, are those cables so well managed that you cannot remove that button and change out the light or change out the battery? So all that positioning has to be considered. Your rail estate is also going to be an issue, okay? This rail is long enough, I would be comfortable with a dual switch back here and holding the rifle back here. Not as ideal as holding it that much further forward and having more mass under my control. But it would be doable. On some of my longer rifles with longer rails, that laser's pushed all the way forward, and so I have a dual pad system because their switches are where I'm the most comfortable holding that gun rather than overextending my arm all the way and locking it out. So how you're comfortable with holding the gun, the amount of rail estate that you have are all going to kind of influence how you set these two things up, and especially that laser, okay? Now, both lasers, again, similar setup, they're basically pushed as far forward on the rail as they really can be. I could move this one a little bit further forward, but I didn't want it hanging over the front of the rail. And again, I'm going for direct activation, so that much further forward is starting to put my hand in a position where I'm not the most comfortable with it. Now, you can run dual pads, and the dual remote switches for light and laser has the benefit of being the least amount of movement of your thumb to activate one or the other. The downside is that it brings your thumb, basically as far away as it's going to get from your mode switch, all right? Having your thumb close to that mode switch is great because you might push out, high power, and then that high power laser spot blooms out your target. Well, then you can just reach over and change it. Now you're on low power, hit the fire button again. Now you can see target, confirm sights, and fire, all right? That's gonna obviously delay the engagement process, but that's better than totally blooming out your target and hoping that the target is still behind that laser spot and firing. Hope is not a good aiming scheme. So that is an advantage to it, okay? People with smaller hands have a harder time with that, and so the remote switches tend to make more sense for them, all right? With mounting remote switches, they do not cause light NDs, all right? Users cause light NDs. A light ND is a light negligent discharge. We talked about it with the white light in the beginning of the video. Same thing with IR. You can push IR when you didn't intend to. That's an ND. If you are NDing your light and blaming your switch, you're a bobo. Either you are grabbing your rifle in a lazy manner that's putting your hand on the switch, or you did not put enough thought into your setup, and the way you normally grab the rifle is activating one or more of your light sources, right? So don't do that. Place your switches to where they have to be intentionally activated by you, and they're not under your normal grip. So when I normally run the rifle, I keep my thumb just on the side of the device, and then if I need the laser, it's over to the laser, over to the light. Same for this one, okay? Now, to talk about this, kind of the elephant in the room, I'm sure a lot of people have already noticed, and I do get questions about it a lot in person. It's not technically backwards. Yeah, it's backwards by the design in that the button is supposed to be facing you and you push forward into it. The thing about the accent switch is it's a momentary and a click on, click off, and a lot of people have an issue with in firing, the recoil pushes the switch in their thumb and clicks it on, so when they let go of the switch, right, the light stays on. By turning it around, that served the primary purpose of being able to keep the switch far enough away that I could take off the cap, remove the battery, replace it, but it also kept it close enough to minimize the movement of my thumb from one switch to the other. When it was facing me, it was a little too much movement, and so I had to make a small adjustment in my hand, and I didn't want to have to do that. I wanted to have my cake and eat it too. Now, unintended happy consequence is that when I engage the light and I fire, the recoil impulse is enough to pull the switch away, not enough for me to lose the light, but enough that I don't click it on, so when I release, my light goes off. So if you're having issues with your accent switch, try that out. Try turning it around and running it that way and see if that doesn't solve the problem for you. Okay. So I want it on the top because if I try mounting the laser to say a Picatinny rail section that I'm going to bolt into like the M-lock, or I'll bolt into the L-dub rail, or whatever the rail is, you're once again increasing the points of failure, and you're not going to be able to guarantee the zero on that laser. Enough people are already worried about rail shift, so you want to talk about rail shift, and now you want to add your laser to a spot that's going to come loose and can break away. So don't do that. Mount to 12 o'clock where that rail is, or the pick rail is built into that handguard. Okay. On top of that, I don't want anything on the bottom because that can interfere with me being able to brace this gun on objects for supported shots at distance. And, you know, mounting stuff on the sides, again, same thing. When I go around a barricade, try to brace off of it, things mounted on the sides of the gun can also interfere. Now, I can get away with it with the light because I can just jam that into the barricade and fire. It might hurt the light, but I can manage that, right? That is something I can work around. If I damage my laser, I can't really work around that as easily. That's going to present a lot of different problems for me. So I want to keep it up here. It's going to keep it protected. It's going to help prevent inadvertent activation, minimize snag, all that good stuff. Now, when you have a much shorter rail, there is a tendency for folks to pull the laser back towards the receiver and towards your optic. And there's a lot of pictures of guys running it that way overseas. It can work as long as you're not bobo enough to put your pressure pad on the top rail and then you go to fire the laser and it just reflects off your hand and you can't figure out why, it's because you're an idiot. So if you pull the laser module towards the rear, you obviously need to make sure that where you activate it, your hands are free and clear and not obstructing the laser. Now, the thing about pulling that further to the rear is just like you talked about, you mentioned there's shadow cast by your light and the suppressor. Now you fire that IR illuminator and all of this mass of the gun is doing that exact same thing. All right, what is that shadow doing? That shadow is minimizing the amount of information that you are gaining and the point of firing off that illuminator, okay? The more dialed in the illuminator is, that obviously mitigates it. Knowing when and where to be able to use that illuminator. So again, having your thumb close to the function switch so you can use the tools that you want and not the ones you don't. But that light, whether it's illuminator or the laser or both, is going to reflect off of the platform, and that can degrade your image. Close quarters, not a big deal. Things more at distance, that can become an issue with being able to have enough clarity to still engage that target. All right. So I don't recommend pulling it back towards the rear. It was something that we had to do with like the M4A1 and the Mark 18 Mod 0, where we had that fixed front sight post and gas block. All right, very, very limited on the rail estate. Just about 6 inches of rail. So a lot of guys would pull the laser back so they could get their hand in a comfortable position on the gun. And then, change things up. And when those guns are primarily used in close quarters, it works just fine, okay? But when you consider the totality of what you do, that may be an issue for you. If you're a guy who only works in close quarters, then hey, maybe not a big deal and you can run it that way, all right? Just think about the totality of environments where you're gonna be able to use those tools or need to use those tools, and make sure you're setting up to mitigate anything that is going to degrade your ability to do so, all right? The diving board mounts and all that, really not necessary. If you're worried about rail flex, don't build your gun for nods and lasers on a shitty platform, okay? If you can get a better rail and put it on your existing rifle, do that. If you need to get an overall better rifle, then get the better rifle. If you're making this investment, there's no point in putting lipstick on a pig, all right? And if you're a guy who's only concerned about working in close quarters, then the rail shift is not going to matter at all. The diving board mounts and all that are really good for very short platforms. We're talking like entering the sub gun classification of small arms, to where there isn't a whole lot to hold on to and to mount stuff to in the first place. So you have that diving board to mount that laser. You're also going to run into issues if you had something like this and I've got a diving board mount with my laser up here. That means I need to have a lead long enough in order to fire that laser. And now if I fire that laser into an illuminator and I recognize I need a different mode, right, I've got to completely break my grip, come back to that laser module, make the adjustment, go back, fire the laser, and then hopefully be engaging. So it's just increasing the amount of time, increasing movements, increasing the amount of things that can go wrong. So why I don't recommend doing any of that stuff unless you absolutely have to, okay? So I think I've covered enough about mounting, considerations for all that. The last thing I'm going to talk about is zeroing, all right? The laser is a sight. It needs to be zeroed, okay? And we have mechanical offset, but with the laser, it's negligible, all right? And our two methods for zeroing are going to be the parallel offset or a converging zero. Parallel offset, sometimes also called constant offset. The idea between those is I have my line of bores, that imaginary line that goes on to infinity, and then I have the laser that comes out. And the laser, as far as we're concerned, is completely unaffected within our visible range by gravity. So with that parallel or constant offset, wherever I'm pointing that laser, I am also pointing my muzzle basically right at that spot, whether it's right in front of me or it's 500 yards away, right? I am pointing my laser and my gun at the exact same spot. So no matter the engagement distance, all I really have to consider is that mechanical offset, which again, this is negligible. So in close quarters, it's nothing, right? Point at center, fire, kill the bad guy. At distance, if I am going to be engaging, you know, past 200 yards, which is not a common thing to have to do at night, just because the ability to identify targets beyond that range, all I have to consider is how much is this bullet dropping, and do I need to make a wing call? Which again, typical engagement distances with a laser, I don't need to consider the wind, and the amount of hold that needs to be applied is usually going to be minimal to none, because we're typically engaging inside 200 yards of what I can actually pick up and identify with my night vision and engage accurately with a carbine, okay? I have done it beyond that, and so because of that, I prefer the parallel offset, so I never had to concern myself where the converging point is. With the convergence point, and I'll kind of, well, you guys won't be able to see it, so the laser's firing out and the barrel's going. That's my constant offset. With converging, I am adjusting that laser to come down and meet that trajectory at a very specific point. And honestly, if I do it the right way, it doesn't matter if you choose the constant offset or converging. The problem with converging isn't in the methodology of it, it's how it's executed. And what most people will do is they'll set up 25 yards because everyone thinks that's like the magical distance to zero at. And they'll go point of impact at 25. So inside of 25, it's effectively point of aim, point of impact. I really don't need to consider the mechanical offset at all. But now I have to engage beyond 25. And at 50 yards, you know, my gun is pointing at the center of the target, but my laser will be off on the side. Or the other way, if I put my laser center of the target, my gun is now pointed not where that laser spot is. Again, 50 yards, not a huge deal. You're going to hit, you know, just a little bit off to the side of where your laser spot is. 100 yards, 200 yards. 200 yards, you are absolutely missing the target, right? Whatever you put that laser on, you are missing. 100 yards, you might wing it in the side, okay? So you want to make sure that you zero appropriately, and a 200-yard converging zero is just fine, because again, the vast majority of your engagements are going to be inside of that. But if that time should come where you have a target that you have identified that is beyond that 200 yards, now you also have to add in not just how much is my bullet dropping, do I need to make a wind call, but where is that laser spot in relation to the trajectory of my round now? Okay. So a little bit more to think about there. Is that something you need to be considered with or aware of? Does that matter for you in your use case? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? If it's a no, then fucking send it, do the 25, point of aim, point of impact. You'll probably be all right. But if not, and you're a professional and you care about being able to engage regardless, quickly and accurately, I encourage the parallel offset. But at minimum, make sure you do either one appropriately. I will do a separate video on that because there's a lot of information to talk about. All right. So this was, you know, lights and lasers, some considerations for setting them up. I'll probably say some things that upset you and you disagree with. By all means, take to the comments. Do what you're going to do. And I'll, you know, check that from time to time and answer questions and everything. Hopefully I'm back now. The goal will be to start pushing more regular content here on this channel, long form stuff of the shorter topics I cover on other platforms. I'll continue to push out there on other platforms. You can find me on Instagram, find me on X. I do have a Patreon. I need to pick it up there as well. So if you are a patron, I appreciate you, especially if you've been there from the beginning. Thanks for sticking around. And if you watch all the way into this video, I appreciate it. And I will catch you on the next one.